because there is such a hesitance sometimes to self-diagnose as people, particularly, but then that extends to organization. It's kind of like you go back to the Al Mulally, and it required that at a certain point there was a comfort level of trust to be able to say, you know what, as awesome as we are, we could be awesomer. Is that a word? More awesome. And this is the way to do it. All right, so let's hear from some of you. First of all, let's just how about some of the, well, let's just go through the organizational. I probably don't even need an extra sheet for this, but what are some of the dominant mindset styles organizationally or departmentally, however you decided to answer that question? Go ahead and tell me why.
I'm just going to, in our group, Shannon and I were just talking about this, and it's very interesting in terms of how she saw and tied it to our population, the people we serve, the volunteers, and the employees. And in our industry, if you look at whether it's children or older adults being mistreated or unappreciated, you see that as something that happens here. People feel sometimes they're unappreciated or mistreated in some way. And then you look at the quadrant worse than needy, that we have a lot of people who are needy for that affirmation that they're okay people and that kind of thing. And then it overwhelms us because there's so much need out there. It is so, I feel for the organization, we're always struggling because we don't have all the resources we need to really address the demand for the type of services, the care, all those things that we want to do.
Right.
So you become anxious, you get stressed, you get sad.
That's very powerful, Michelle. One thing that nonprofits, particularly real mission-driven nonprofits, can be susceptible to is the I deserve box organization. Because at the end of the day, first of all of you are affiliated with this organization. Because in addition to the fact that there's a living attached to it, there's something that's very positive about this nobility of the cause that you're engaged in. But is there anything more frustrating than meeting somebody in the general public that either doesn't have a clue what you do or doesn't really think of it as all that valuable and worth investing in? And how easily that invitation comes to go into the I deserve box. And then we can find ourselves potentially in that I deserve box. It's almost coming across as preachy. Better than. In other words, all these wonderful virtues can also go to the opposite end of it. I was talking to this was a large church, and they were talking about the susceptibility they have as far as implementing some of these things, because some of these things come so natural. They're all about building the person, that they can fail to institutionalize some of the things that build the people because they feel like it all of a sudden comes so second nature to them. And yet they realize they have lack of consistency across the board as far as their counselors and the work that they're doing, because they just fail to even see that, because their own virtue, which is truly a virtue, has made them blind to the need of systematizing things. In other words, there's susceptibility in all of these. But I've always thought about that. Benavide is one of those organizations that does such incredible work and it makes such an enormous impact. And it can be very easy to wander into that I deserve box, organizationally speaking. And then for us to begin to portray that. Sarah, as you're talking to organizations and things, I mean, that's got to be so incredibly tough sometimes to know this unbelievable story. You've seen firsthand the impact that things are being made here, and then you're having to try and translate this to somebody who's just not getting it. They're not getting it. It's like if this was your family, a family member, you'd be all over this. How can I make this relevant to them? That's the most frustrating thing in the world. And how quickly that can lead us to this I deserve. Also, as we're talking to a corporation, and again, just we're putting things in terms of development here, but they can wander in other areas. Could we potentially susceptible to a better than box? Here we as an organization are going about doing so much good, they're just selling cars. Could our demeanor and our conversation with them belie the fact that we value what we do greater than what they do organizationally? Now, I would like to think the society, by the way, would agree with you on that instance, but that doesn't mean that we are given license to stop treating them as people and seeing them as people. What else? conversations took place. That was great, thank you. Other conversations and thoughts. Other boxes that we might find dominant in the work environment, organizationally.
I think with all the different departments that we have, they feel a different thing in each category, you know? Like, I think across the board, all the departments are probably overwhelmed, for sure. But I think that, you know, some of them feel unappreciated, some of them may feel impatient with others, some of them may feel like, well, I deserve this because, you know, I'm bringing in the money or whatnot.
I think you put your finger on it. Typically speaking, and especially in mission-driven nonprofits, you're always being asked to do more with less. And that affects each one of you individually. And so sometimes we can become so attuned to how much we are doing beyond what we really have the resources all the time, whatever else to do, we find ourselves in that box, and the organization can take on that. All we're doing here is we're not saying you bad employee at all. What we're trying to do is become sensitive to our susceptibility of how easily we can wander into a box. And how once we do that, we actually end up becoming detrimental to the overall mission of the organization. So the quicker we can recognize it, and I think that's a perfectly stated example, particularly the mission-driven nonprofit. It's such a great cause. You're doing more with less. If I suddenly came in with a check of $1 million, you would have a use for it immediately. You'd be like, where did that
Spent.
Yeah, completely. You wouldn't be sitting around saying, well, I don't know, all right, give us some time, we can figure out maybe something, we can allocate that, right? That predisposes you to a certain mindset in a certain box, and you can become very susceptible organization if you wander into that, all right? We won't belabor that point. Hopefully you kind of see that these are things we kind of need to be sensitive to and aware of, because we can find ourselves in a box, and then suddenly the way that we're portraying ourselves to the entire community can become a distortion because we have all joined into the same box. We'll see how that plays out a little later on. Whoops, what happened?
Just go to move that.
Let's look forward.
There you go.
Oh, got it back. Are we on the right spot though? Oh, very strange. Well, what are you doing?
She knew what was going on. Touch it. I want to touch it.
Yeah, well, you're back. I thought
All right, we're good. All right, so let's go on here. Go back to your key objective map. Where are we on lunch stuff? Are we doing okay time-wise?
Yeah, I think the lunch is here. I think they just.
No.
Oh, they took out. Oh, they took out. Oh, okay.
I just don't know what time.
10, 15 minutes? Are we-
Yeah.
All right. All right, let's go ahead and let's go back to the key objective map. Okay. And all I want you to think about here is go through and list the box styles that you sometimes exhibit toward these individuals. Okay, and then there's an example. We're gradually building this, and we're becoming so much more tuned. We're essentially dissecting these relationships, utilizing these new frameworks and tools that we have. But I hope, I remember one time Alan was talking about how it was this dual element that took place. Remember, he says at the very same time he saw, oh my gosh, this is horrible, we're in a bad situation. At the very same instance, he realized that, wait, we have the power to change this now. Because the data says you're free, right? And so as we go through this, there will be times where you're becoming alive and aware of the fact that, oh my gosh, I do this, or we do this, or I'm seeing this. And it's very easy to stop and dwell on that. But what's really being given to you is an opportunity now to completely radically change and alter those things. But without that information, you never have the impetus for change. Okay? So let's take a moment, go ahead and just write down next to any of those individuals, any boxes that you might find yourself wandering into with any of those individuals. like this one? Everybody has an I deserve box with finance. Okay, there's plenty of room on that P&L. Add another line. By the way, at the very end, tomorrow will actually, it's based on a company called Tubular Steel. Will actually be tomorrow. The CEO was the one who replaced the individuals in the book. This is an assemblage of true to life things we've done in a narrative format to convey these principles. Here's the danger of the box. Over time, as we betray ourselves, okay, remember that betrayal that takes place, and that's how I end up in the box where it's at a certain point I choose to not see them as a person, and then I begin to justify my betrayal of them, and that's when I become self-deceived. From that point on, our relationship is at risk of problems. Over time, as we betray ourselves, we come to see ourselves in various self-justifying ways. We end up carrying these self-justifying images with us into new situations. And to the extent that we do, we enter new situations already in the box. We don't see people straightforwardly as people. Rather, we see them in terms of the self-justifying images we've created. If people act in ways that challenge the claim made by a self-justifying image, we see them as threats. If they reinforce the claim made by a self-justifying image, we see them as allies. If they fail to matter to a self-justifying image, we see them as unimportant. Whichever way we see them, they're just objects to us. We're already in the box. The dangerous and scary part of this is the more time we spend going into these various different boxes, they gradually become part of our character and our personality, which is why later on we'll see this a little bit more in depth, which is why sometimes even changing organizations, changing relationships. At the end of the day, if I carry around the box with me, and I think by escaping that relationship with that organization will fix things, well, all I'm doing is carrying that box into the next situation, and it's only a matter of time before the same problems emerge. Okay? You see this a lot in family relationships, in organizational relationships, and other things. So it becomes very paramount, important to figure out and begin to gain a sensitivity toward knowing when you're going into the box. Sometimes you might find suddenly that you're in a box, but you don't really ever remember betraying a choice with that person that led you into the box. Usually that's an indication that you are already there. You need to go back further. And again, you don't have to take this and sit down at the end of the day and retrace all of your box steps and go back to these choices. But just to have this notion in mind, the core of self-deception is an initial betrayal and a choice that we've made that's forever put us into this other box. Okay? Now, when we come back after lunch, we're going to dive into, and there have been a couple of questions, Michelle particularly goes into this, how do these boxes multiply? What are the implications of that, the ramifications? It's actually a fascinating thing to wander into. And then we'll actually end the day toying around and figuring out, all right, once you know you're in the box, how do you get out? Because you all know it's not the kind of thing you could just decide, I'm not going to feel bitter toward that person anymore. I'm not going to feel less than that person anymore. You can't do that, can you? There's something visceral that just keeps us there. So we're going to learn, how do we actually get out? So when we come back from lunch, how do these things multiply? We're going to look at an outward mindset in a work environment, what that would look like. And then we're going to explore how it is that we get out of this box so that we end the day on a hopeful tone going into tomorrow. Okay? Before we end, any thoughts that have been bouncing around in your head as you're kind of digesting and synthesizing some of this information? Or any questions?
How long does it really take for someone to find out when they create that box? Because it could have been years ago.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, after you carrying it around with you, and then, so will these maps help you to get you back?
Yeah, that's a great, Michelle, I promise you, I'm not paying her with these lists of questions that are meant to be a shadow. But, you know, I want you to think about another option to that. Sometimes it's not only carrying on, but are there such things as multi-generational boxes? Are there such things as cultural boxes? If you look at, for example, conflict in the Middle East, were any of the individuals there around at the time that it was partitioned for the British Mandate in '48? No, very few of them were. Those that were either children or teens. They weren't experiencing that firsthand. And yet they lived with the mindset that came from that. Now, does that mean there aren't actual wrongs and things that we corrected and righted? Of course not. But we'll explore that. Not only that, but as an individual, you you could be carrying a box for a long time. And sometimes, and well, actually, I'll share an experience of mine, how a long-held box of mine, I wasn't even completely aware of until it was pierced in a particular moment. And then I became so almost embarrassingly and humbled in recognizing that I've been in a box for this person for so long, and I didn't even realize it because I was so comfortable in that box. I'd long since stopped feeling those emotions that are attached to the initial entrance in the box. And so what do we do in those instances? And what can we do that can begin? It's kind of like you go in and you see some of these spy movies where there's these lasers all over that are meant to keep people from coming. You can't see them, but then they throw some sort of powder over it and suddenly they all appear. What we're exploring here over the rest of the day is that powder that suddenly brings these boxes and these all these things that we're experiencing to life. We're going to get into something in a moment here called collusion, where you come back. And you're going to become more aware and sensitive to that. And then you're going to leave today, and you're going to suddenly notice it'll be as if this dust is sprinkled over a lot of things. You're going to see these lasers all over, which is wonderful. The danger to that is that sometimes we can become almost overwhelmed by recognizing how many boxes we're in and we're carrying with us, how many collusions we're in, how many people or senses that we've betrayed. Recognize that nothing has changed between now and then. You just become alive to those things. You remember the situation there with Jeff. Nothing had changed. That whole thing had taken place up here. But now you're given the opportunity to actually do something about it. We'll wander into that. But yeah, not just long-term box carrying, multi-generational. Think about that in the United States. Political, multi-generational box carrying. Religion nowadays, it wasn't always like this, but it's treated like religion. There is an orthodoxy to these parties. And you can be excommunicated. And I mean, it's saying we're in an interesting situation. We won't wander in. I'm told Dave stopped talking about politics. It's not where we go with this. Actually, we do at a much deeper level, but not in an organizational setting. But you can see how susceptible we all become to it. Okay? Any other thoughts? Anything else resonating? Let's see, it's noon. What we want to do is we really want to try and kick back off by about 12:45. We can take 45. Realize usually when I say 45 minutes, that means we'll be starting in about 55. I would like us to try and be able to dive back in about 12:45. I understand you have life and you've got an organization to run, and so do what you need to do, but let's just